In November 2001, a German historian walked into the British National Archive in London and asked for a set of documents he had heard existed somewhere in the building. He expected very little. What arrived at his desk was a bundle of 800 pages. Transcripts, dated September 1943, conversations between German prisoners of war, recorded secretly without their knowledge, while they sat in their cells and common rooms and dining halls believing they were alone. He began to read. What he found in those pages would take him 10 years to fully process. Because what German soldiers said about Hitler when they thought nobody was listening was not what the world had been told for 50 years. And the world had been told a great deal. This is that story. Before we go any further, if this story is moving you, a like takes 2 seconds and it helps this channel reach more people who care about what really happened. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week we go deep into the moments and the men that history almost forgot. Now, back to 1943. The man who walked into that archive was Sank Neitzel. He was a professor of military history, methodical and careful, not given to dramatic discoveries. He had been researching German U-boat warfare and had heard, almost in passing, that recordings existed somewhere of German POWs being monitored by Allied intelligence. He was curious. He filed a request. He waited. When the bundle arrived, he read through the first pages slowly, then faster. Then he put down the documents and sat very still for a moment. These were not interrogation transcripts. These were private conversations. Soldiers talking to soldiers. Officers talking to officers. Men who believed, with absolute certainty, that no one was listening. Men who had spent years in a system where saying the wrong thing meant death, and who now, for the first time, were saying exactly what they thought. By the end of his investigation, Neitzel had found 48,000 pages in Britain and more than 100,000 pages in Washington. 150,000 pages in total. Classified for 50 years. Declassified in 1996. Sitting untouched in 2 national archives for 5 years after that, until a historian with a research question about submarines happened to ask for them. Here is the number that should stop you cold. 50 years. The Allies had kept these recordings classified for half a century. Not because they were embarrassed by what they had done, but because they didn't want anyone to know how they had done it. Every square inch of P.O. Box 1142 at Fort Hunt, Virginia, the most secret interrogation facility in America, had been bugged. The bedrooms, the mess hall, the common rooms, the trees in the garden. Microphones hidden everywhere a man might sit and speak freely. Sophisticated gramophone equipment recording every word. In a bunker dug underground beneath the facility, American intelligence officers sat with headphones, listening in silence to what German soldiers said to each other when they believed the war had taken everything from them except each other. Let me tell you what Fort Hunt looked like. The prisoners arrived on a bus with blacked-out windows. They did not know where they were. They were somewhere near Washington, D.C. That was all. The facility itself looked almost pleasant. There were barracks, a garden, spaces to move around. The Germans who had good information were treated well. Some were taken to restaurants in civilian clothes. Some were given drinks, given small luxuries, given the impression that the war was, for them, over, and that the reasonable thing to do was relax. What they did not know was that every word they spoke was being recorded. The man listening was often Rudy Pins. He was 24 years old. He had been born in Germany. His family was Jewish. He had fled at age 14 in 1934 on a train, kissed his father goodbye at the platform and never saw him again. His parents were executed in the Holocaust. He was raised by American foster parents in Ohio. When the Army changed its policy on Jewish immigrants serving in uniform, Pins enlisted immediately. He expected to be sent overseas to fight. Instead, a colonel handed him a piece of paper with a phone number and told him to take a bus to Alexandria, Virginia. He ended up at Fort Hunt. "I used to sit across from enemy soldiers," Pins said later, "who in combat would have killed me, and I probably would have killed them." Now he was listening to them talk, through headphones, in a bunker, about the war, about their comrades, about what they had seen on the Eastern Front, about what they believed would happen next, about Hitler. In Germany, talking honestly about Hitler was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of survival. The Third Reich had built one of the most effective systems of internal surveillance and terror in history. Political officers monitored units for signs of disloyalty. Men were executed for defeatism, the crime of suggesting in any form that Germany might lose the war. Letters home were censored. Conversations with strangers were dangerous. The entire architecture of the Nazi state was built on the premise that no German soldier would ever be able to say out loud what he actually thought. And it worked. For years, it worked. The soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front, who had watched Stalingrad, who had seen the supply lines collapse, who had buried their friends in Russian mud, came home on leave and said nothing. They wrote letters home that said nothing. They spoke at dinner tables about nothing, because saying something was death. When those same men arrived at Fort Hunt, something changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, as the days passed and no political officer appeared and no one was shot for saying the wrong thing, the men began to relax. They began to talk the way they had not been able to talk in years, about what they had really seen, about what they really thought, about the system that had sent them to fight a war that many of them, by 1943, already knew was lost. The recordings reveal something that the official history of the Third Reich had almost entirely erased: the private voice of the German soldier. Not the voice he used in public, disciplined, ideologically correct, dutiful, but the voice he used with his comrades, when the doors were closed and the lights were low and he believed, truly believed, that no one was listening. What that voice said about Hitler was not what anyone expected. It was not simple hatred. It was not simple loyalty. It was the voice of men who had believed in something and watched it destroy everything they cared about, and who were only now, in captivity, beginning to say what they had known for years. By 1943, a significant number of German soldiers already knew the war was lost. Not suspected, knew. They had seen the evidence on the Eastern Front. They had watched the Sixth Army die at Stalingrad. They had counted the supply trains that didn't arrive and the reinforcements that didn't come and the promises that were made and broken and made again. They knew, but they could not say so. Not in Germany. Not under the system. In captivity, they said so. They said that the men who had been sent to die at Stalingrad had been abandoned. That the command decisions made in Berlin bore no relationship to the reality on the ground. That soldiers had been sacrificed for objectives that had no military logic, only ideological ones. They talked about Hitler not as a god or a savior, but as the man who had promised them victory and delivered catastrophe. A system that had demanded their loyalty and spent their lives. A machine that had taken the best years of their generation and fed it into a war they already understood had been lost. They said things about that system that, in Germany, would have been punished with a bullet. And what they said about Hitler himself was perhaps the most revealing thing of all. Not rage, not worship, but the quiet, exhausted verdict of men who had given everything for a cause and were only now, in captivity, allowing themselves to wonder if it had been worth it. The recordings destroyed a narrative that had survived for 50 years, the myth of the unblemished Wehrmacht. The professional soldier who knew nothing, who simply followed orders, who was separate from the crimes of the regime. What the private voice revealed was something more complicated and more human. Men who had known far more than they ever admitted. Men who talked, in captivity, with the casual frankness of people who no longer had anything to hide. The recordings showed what German soldiers said when the system that had silenced them was finally gone. They were speaking to us, because the Americans wrote down every word, and classified it for 50 years. And when the files were finally opened, a historian happened to ask for them on a November morning in 2001, while the rest of the world was still reeling from a different kind of shock. They were speaking to us. Sönke Neitzel published his findings in 2011 in a book called Soldaten. It became an immediate bestseller in Germany. It spawned theater productions and a television documentary. It was published in 20 countries, because what it contained was not what the world had been told for 50 years. And people recognized that. Now, here is what no history book fully captures. The men who spoke in those rooms at Fort Hunt did not know they were creating history. They thought they were having private conversations. They thought they were speaking only to their cellmates, their fellow prisoners, the men who had survived the same things they had survived. And it was Rudy Pins, a 24-year-old Jewish refugee from Germany, sitting in a bunker with headphones, listening to the men who had murdered his family talk freely about what they really thought, who first heard it. He never talked about what he heard. For decades, he kept the oath of secrecy he had sworn. He became a lawyer. He grew old in America. When journalists finally found him in the early 2000s and asked him what it had been like to sit across from those men and listen, he paused for a long time before answering. "You don't get people to talk," he said finally, "by beating them or forcing them. If you make life fairly easy for them, they relax." And when German soldiers relaxed, when they finally believed, for the first time in years, that no one was listening, they told the truth. All 150,000 pages of it. If this story changed the way you think about what those men knew and what they said, leave a like. It helps this channel reach more people who care about this history. And it means more than you know. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. And now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in any war, any branch, any country, tell me about them in the comments. Their name, where they went, what they did. Those names deserve to be spoken. This channel exists because of stories like theirs. We'll see you in the next one.